You know, sometimes you know what you know, sometimes you know what you don't know, sometimes you don't know what you don't know, sometimes you don't even know what you thought you knew, and sometimes, as the Firesign Theater reminds us,
you know that you're wrong, but you fear you're right. You suspect you're out of sync. You think that you're out of your mind. Everything you know is wrong.
Is it possible everything you know about the founding of this country is wrong? I love the old Firesign Theater line, Ben Franklin, the only president of the United States who was never president of the United States. Now comes a book about English scientist, philosopher, and theologian Joseph Priestley, one of the major influencers of the American Republic and certainly our way of looking at the world. That is, you know, one of the founders, arguably, that probably you've never heard of. The book is The Invention of Air, a story of science, faith, revolution, and the birth of America. The author is Stephen Johnson, the author of Ghost Map. And Stephen Johnson, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks. Great to be here.
Great to have you with us. And let's see, there's a website for your book, I'm assuming, StephenBerlinJohnson.com, right?
Yep, that's my site and blog and all the various things you expect to find on a website these days.
Great. So Joseph Priestley, tell us about this guy.
Yeah, he's just an incredible figure, and it was really fun to get to kind of shine some light on him. He's probably most famous, if you've heard of him, you've probably heard of him from your kind of high school chemistry class as the guy who was the first person to isolate oxygen for the first time.
Right.
Although, in some ways, as I discuss in the book, he wasn't technically the first, and he kind of got it wrong when he did. But that's what he's kind of famous
As is
for.
often the case. I mean,
yeah, there's always some kind of...
Marconi didn't actually invent radio. Bell didn't actually invent the phone. And on it goes. I mean, isn't it interesting how so many of these major inventions were actually stumbled upon by multiple people at identical times? It's almost like there's a certain international body of knowledge, you know, the shoulders of giants upon which these inventors stand, that reaches a critical threshold where the next step just becomes obvious.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to write about in this book is both the story of Priestley and the founding fathers, but also this period is such an incredible period of innovation across the board. And so it's partially a story of these great lives, but it's also kind of wrestling with this question of, like, why are there certain periods where suddenly ideas just seem to explode everywhere and people seem just really innovative in all these different fields. And Priestley may have been, you know, in some ways with Franklin, the most great, you know, kind of the most accomplished cross-disciplinary thinker of that period. He was a brilliant chemist. He actually did some important work with electricity. Was an important theologian. Did important linguistic scholarship and wrote about politics extensively. So he was just influential in all these different fields in precisely the way that Franklin and Jefferson in their different ways were. But the thing that drew me into his story is that in partially in collaboration with Franklin, he was the first person to realize that plants were creating oxygen. Mm-hmm. And that's really, in some ways, the beginning of our kind of ecosystems view of the world. The only reason we have air to breathe is because it's manufactured by plants as part of photosynthesis. The Earth's atmosphere would be less than 1% oxygen if it weren't for the plants.
Right. And in fact, there was a time when it was. I mean,
that's right.
The earliest, what we would call protoplants, were actually absorbing carbon and nitrogen. And you know, they emitted oxygen as a waste material. This was, you know, what, 2 billion years ago.
Yep.
And that oxygen was toxic to them. And when they emitted so much oxygen that the atmosphere became toxic to them, they died off and were replaced by a photosynthetic variety of plants that consumed the oxygen. That continued to produce oxygen.
It was the planet's first great pollution crisis. Really, in a funny way. Yeah. So it turns out, I got interested in that story, and then it turns out that Priestley, though he was British by birth, is as you alluded to, he's bound up in the history of the American story and the American founders in all these ways. I mean, he was the one who wrote the first popular account of Franklin and the kite, for instance, in his book on electricity. Like, we wouldn't know that story probably if it weren't for Priestley. And he ended up getting so controversial in England that he was driven out. An angry mob literally burns down his house, and he emigrates to America and becomes really our first great scientist, intellectual, emigre, coming here, for the kind of intellectual freedom of this new country.
How did he influence the founders of this country and the thinking of the founders of this country?
Well, in lots of different ways. One of the ones that I found so interesting is that he had the single biggest impact on Jefferson's religious views of anyone from that period. And
even Benjamin Rush. Yeah. I've read a lot of Jefferson's letters, and he corresponded extensively with Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a deist, about deism and about religion. By the way, we're speaking with Stephen Johnson, his new book, The Invention of Air, The Story of Science, Faith, Revolution, and the Birth of America. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, there's a famous letter where kind of Rush kind of forces Jefferson to kind of state whether he's really a Christian or not, or kind of take a stand on this. And one of the things that Jefferson says is that he's a Christian in the basic sense of that he believes in the teachings of Christ, but he does not believe in the corruptions of Christianity, and that's a direct allusion to Priestley's book, The History of the Corruptions of Christianity. And what Priestley believed is that, in a sense, that there was this original core message that Christ had. It was a moral code that was worth orienting your life around. It was important to, but that story had been distorted by layers and layers and layers of kind of theologians and priests who had added all this kind of mystery and magic to it.
Well, and if his perspective was like Jefferson's and Rush's, then he would probably have been suggesting that moral code preceded any kind of religion.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
That religion adopted that moral code from society rather than the other way around.
Yeah. Exactly. And so, I mean, in the famous Jefferson Bible, where he kind of remixed the Bible, cut out almost everything, but
he cut out all the miracles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That was directly inspired by Priestley's book on the corruptions of Christianity. So, so a huge impact there. And then the other thing that happened was he got when Priestley arrived here, he got bound up. He had been very close to Adams, but then kind of had this falling out when Adams and Jefferson had their falling out, and he started writing a bunch of things critical of the Adams administration. And so he became really the most celebrated figure who was, under threat during the Alien and Sedition controversies. And
that's interesting.
There's a kind of crucial moment when Pickering recommends to Adams that they arrest and deport Priestley because he wasn't a citizen. And Adams has this moment where he's like, okay, what are we going to do here? This is my old friend who's kind of betrayed me, is probably one of the leading, if not the leading intellectual in this country. What kind of country are we going to be? Are we going to deport these people for writing op-eds against us, or are we going to let them live?
Well, he'd already put 20 of them in prison for that.
That's right, but he decides not to with Priestley. It's this kind of crucial moment in the history of the country, and why he did that is a whole other question that I talk about in the book. But so he's kind of like this zealot, he keeps showing up, and then he has a massive impact on the Adams-Jefferson letters. In some ways, he's the one, even though he'd been dead for 10 years, he's the one who kind of sparks that conversation, because basically Jefferson writes Priestley this glowing letter after he becomes president, which says all these extremely critical things about Adams. And 10 years later, Adams somehow uncovers this letter, which has been published in some book, overseas, and he writes this incredibly angry letter to Jefferson saying, "How could you say these things about me? How could you say things?" And that's what really starts the great conversation of the Adams-Jefferson letter.
Well, I thought there was also a third party. I thought it was Ben Rush who went to Jefferson and said, you really need to reconcile or heal this relationship. And Jefferson wrote to John Adams' wife. I've actually read his letters to her saying, I never intended to harm you or your husband.
There's a letter to Abigail Adams that happens before that, and then Rush gets them talking to each other directly. Yeah. But the first wave of letters are all kind of chit-chat. They're all like, how many grandkids do you have?
Yeah, exactly. Is it safe to talk again, basically, is what they're saying.
And then this Priestley letter emerges, and Adams just gets enraged and kind of cuts through all the civility. Right. And that's what starts this conversation. And one of the little stats that I mentioned at the beginning of the book is that Priestley's mentioned 51 times in the correspondence, whereas Hamilton and Franklin and Washington together are mentioned less than 10 times.
And one of the really interesting things is how Jefferson and Adams in that later correspondence, and they never met again, by the way, until the day they died, in that later correspondence, how often they circled back around to religion. Adams, who had been openly a Christian and used Christianity as a political tool, and Jefferson, who was more of a deist and avoided Christianity. And they were both talking about how the churches and the priests of the day were exploiting the people using religion.
That's exactly right. And the other thing I think that's important, why I think Priestley is important for now in some ways, is that he's a reminder of how crucial science was to the founders.
Yes.
And then in some ways their belief in progress, their belief in the possibility of kind of inventing new systems for kind of civil life was predicated on the tremendous progress they'd seen in natural philosophy, as it was called then. So they were scientists too.
You're right. They were the children of the Enlightenment. I mean, this was right full-born, right smack in the middle of the high point of the Enlightenment. Stephen Johnson is the author of the book, The Invention of Air, a story of science, faith, revolution, and the birth of America. A fascinating look into the life of Joseph Priestley and all the people around him. StephenBerlinJohnson.com, his website. Stephen, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Enjoyed it.